Now, I alluded to the title essay, Fighters and Writers, which is about various writers and their response and interest in the sport of boxing. But since, and I read from that at other events after the book came out last year, but since 2011 marks a couple significant anniversaries related to someone who means something to me, I'm going to read from an essay called The Fighting Life, which also focuses on multiple authors, but I'm going to just focus on one particular author and how he makes use of boxing in one particular novel. As was mentioned, I'm originally from Detroit, where Joe Louis spent a large part of his youth and learned how to box before becoming the longest reigning heavyweight champion ever, and to date still the one with the most successful title defenses. He died actually 30 years ago this month, and it was 75 years ago this year that he had his first fight with Max Schmeling. And then 2 years later fought Schmeling again. Those two fights, Louis with Schmeling, are important in The Human Stain, a novel by Philip Roth, who's someone who's not usually associated with boxing, although he writes about it in several of his books. But in The Human Stain, he makes a very, I think, clever and subtle use of that bit of boxing history related to Joe Louis. So I'm going to read portions of The Fighting Life dealing with how he does that. And I know these are sort of short sessions. If anyone wants to ask me any questions or follow up any of this, I'll be around the rest of the weekend. I'd be happy to talk about it. Aging, social class, race, gender, nationality. Writers throughout history have used pugilism in order to show characters dealing with such fundamental matters of human experience. Literature abounds with stories of individuals confronting questions of identity through boxing. While numerous authors have devoted full-length works to examinations of the sport and its cultural significance, others, from Homer and Virgil to Norman Mailer and Philip Roth, have incorporated crucial episodes involving boxing into what would not be explicitly called boxing stories. Boxing contributes in crucial ways to characters' development in Roth's The Human Stain. Coleman Silk, the main character in The Human Stain, has a relatively short boxing career. However, the sport essentially forms the person he becomes, the person he creates, and remains long after he leaves the ring. Boxing not only reveals to Silk his capacity to be taken for something other than a black man, it also imparts an outlook and cultivates qualities Silk carries with him into his 70s. Boxing teaches Silk the pleasures and uses of concealment. His immersion in the sport and realization of its mental aspects lead to the decisive moment in the creation of his singular identity. He learns the power of secretiveness. This discovery happens before he briefly becomes a, quote, Howard Negro, unquote, but his time at the all-black college only confirms in him his desire to seize the opportunity for autonomy his boxing experience opened to him. Boxing starts him moving on the road to what he sees as freedom. When his father discovers that he's been boxing, Silk tries to persuade his parent of the glories of boxing, stressing that boxing is not mere fighting motivated by anger, but an orderly sport depending more on thought than on emotion or brute force. While boxing demands thinking, keeping thoughts hidden from opponents is even more important. When exchanging punches with another man, the guy still could have no idea what you were thinking. All the answers that you came up with in the ring, you kept to yourself. And when you let the secret out, you let it out through everything but your mouth. Roth's character discovers that power and pleasure were to be found in being counter-confessional in the same way you were a counter-puncher. After the disappointment of Howard, he reflects back on the sport's principal lesson. Self-knowledge, but concealed. What is as powerful as that? Armed with insights attained through boxing, Silk determines to pursue complete self-discovery in a manner that will permit him to evade the rigid distinctions between the classes and races sanctified by the church and legitimized by schools in mid-20th century America. While still a high school student, he discovers that if he tells no one otherwise, people will think he's Jewish, not colored. After the funeral of his father, just weeks after he left New Jersey for Howard, Silk decides not to return to college. Having decided to lie about his age when filling out Navy enlistment forms, he lies about race too. He could play his skin however he wanted, color himself just as he chose. When later this necessitates a final break with surviving family, he again experienced the power of it as a fighter. He sees repudiating his mother as a test, one for which boxing prepared him. Throw the punch, do the damage. After the birth of his white-looking children, Silk considers revealing the secret to his wife, but lessons learned as a boxer dissuade him from telling her of his blackness. He decides not to shed his mistrust and caution or to surrender the diligence, the discipline, the taking the measure of every last situation that he used to navigate through life to that point. Like a boxer, he takes care to protect himself at all times, to never let his guard down. Heeding the internal voice that counsels, don't do anything. Instead of telling his spouse his full history, he essentially follows the guidance of the boxing instructor who, on the way to a match, did not tell him to say he was white, but only not to mention that he was not. If nothing comes up, Doc Chisner told him, you don't bring it up. You're neither one thing or the other. He follows the dictum subsequently with women and with the military. If nothing comes up, you don't bring it up. Boxing serves as more than a plot device relating to the light-skinned Silk's decision to live as a man with a Jewish background. When narrator Nathan Zuckerman, before learning this secret, realizes Silk, even at the age of 71, has the physique of someone who would seem to have been a cunning and wily competitor at sports rather than an overpowering one, he notices something about Silk's character as well as his appearance. He spies the slick elusiveness of seasoned boxers. Silk's brother, furious about Coleman deciding to live as someone more white than the whites, also sees the parallel with boxing. Coleman was not one of those ex-GIs fighting for integration and equality and civil rights. In Walt's opinion, he was never fighting for anything other than himself. Silky Silk, that's who he fought as and who he fought for. Silk becomes Jewish in the same way former heavyweight champion Max Baer did, strategically. In Beyond Glory, David Margolick notes that Baer's purported Jewishness had considerable commercial consequences in New York in the 1930s, when Jews were all over boxing, not just as fighters and fans, but as everything in between: promoters, trainers, managers, referees, propagandists, equipment manufacturers, suppliers, chroniclers. No major ethnic group in American history ever so dominated an unimportant sport. In order to appeal to the city's Jewish fight fans, Baer claimed his father was Jewish, despite those who said he was the son of a pig farmer. Baer was only 50% Hebrew when he set out for New York, one journalist quipped in 1933. He only became 100% when he arrived in Gotham. Adolf Hitler's rise to power affected attitudes towards boxers. The grim news from Germany only intensified the pride Jews already took in their fighters, especially when they were taking on Germans. So while some Jewish boxers in Germany were fleeing for their lives, Gentile boxers in America were pretending to be Jews. Silk, whom Zuckerman had initially thought of as one of those crimp-haired Jews of a light yellowish skin pigmentation who possessed something of the ambiguous aura of the pale blacks who are sometimes taken for white, pretends to be Jewish for reasons other than financial. When his father first confronts him regarding his surreptitious teenage boxing, Silk explicitly states, "I don't do it for the money." Instead, he does it as part of a strategy in his lifelong passionate struggle for singularity. Roth refers to famous fighters in The Human Stain: Max Schmeling and Joe Louis, boxers whose intertwined histories made a profound impact on the way Americans viewed racial identity in the 1930s, come up in the first conversation Silk has with his parents concerning boxing, which would have occurred during Louis's long reign as champion. When Silk's father tells his son, "If Joe Louis can be knocked cold, Coleman, so can you," he could be expressing concern over more than only the physical dangers of boxing. After Louis lost what Silk refers to as that first fight with Schmeling, he learned from the mistake that Schmeling exploited and became what biographer Chris Mead calls a revolutionary by coincidence. By achieving unprecedented acceptance by white Americans, who were willing to view the boxer as a national representative, Silk's father, a former optician who lost his business during the Depression and resorted to working for the Pennsylvania Railroad in a job where he had to put up with insults in the dining car and prejudicial treatment from the company, knows that whatever gains Louis's accomplishment might represent remained precarious. If Louis exploded the myth of white supremacy, as Mead puts it, he did not end the reality of racism. If even Joe Louis could be knocked out, then improvements in blacks' conditions might be equally fragile. By trading a black identity for a Jewish one, Silk remained among likely admirers of Louis. The fights between Louis and Schmeling made Louis an especially important figure for American blacks and Jews. Schmeling became immediately and inseparably identified with the Nazis, and Jewish organizations regularly sought to frustrate his opportunities to earn money by boxing in the United States. Many Americans regarded him as an official representative of Hitler. Prior to his fights with Baer, the Jewish war veterans, advocates of boycotts against all things associated with the Nazis, sought to have U.S. immigration authorities keep Schmeling out of the country. That's one for Hitler, Baer said after throwing one of the many forceful punches that led to the 10th round stoppage of their 1933 bout. Baer wore a Star of David on his trunks during the fight. The non-sectarian anti-Nazi League boycotted German goods in hopes of damaging Hitler's regime and opposed the planned 1937 fight between Schmeling and then-champion James Braddock. That fight ended up never occurring. Instead, Braddock fought and lost to Lewis that year. Although the perception of Schmeling as an avatar of Nazi ideology preceded his fights with Lewis, those two fights carried a particularly large symbolic load. Schmeling was held up by the Nazis as Superman and exploited for propaganda purposes, especially after he knocked out Joe Louis in 1936. The hostility American Jews felt towards Schmeling before the fight only intensified upon seeing Nazis embrace him afterwards. Photographs of Schmeling socializing with Hitler became popular items for display in New York's Garment District. Picketers urging a boycott of the second Louis Schmeling fight distributed similar pictures. While the Anti-Nazi League could not discourage attendance at the second fight, protesters there handed out flyers explicitly declaring Schmeling as a representative of Nazism. The Nazis promoted the notion that Schmeling, who had won and lost the heavyweight championship earlier in the decade, would bolster their ideas of racial supremacy by regaining the title. Hitler and the Nazis made Schmeling a national hero in Germany. The two Louis Schmeling bouts, and especially the second one, had dramatized Hitler's theories of race and Aryan superiority as few other events had done. And they revealed Nazi attitudes toward blacks that might otherwise never have become an issue because there were so few blacks in Europe. The 1938 bout is widely regarded as a major turning point in prevailing ideas, American ideas, about race. Rather than describing the fight as a contest between a Negro and a white man, as many of them had done only 2 years before, newspapers now depicted it as a struggle between an American and a German. The American symbolized freedom, the German represented fascism. While Lewis's ascension to the heavyweight championship was a source of pride for black Americans, his victory over Schmeling the following year resonated profoundly with Jews. If only Schmeling's collapse can be taken as a portent of the weakness of Nazism as a whole, our troubles are almost over, the Jewish Times opined afterward. Coleman Silk desires what Joe Louis inadvertently achieves, to not be defined exclusively or primarily by racial classification. By becoming the American instead of the Negro fighter, Louis moved into a broader, less confining category. Silk does not vocally assert an assumed Jewishness as Baer did. Instead, he quietly lets other people draw their own conclusions based on his appearance. Just as Louis moved from routine identification as the black fighter or the African to being called simply the American, Silk would prefer to be neither one race nor another, and to be only himself.